So a 10-point peace plan has been proposed by President Cyril Ramaphosa. This is part of an African delegation to mediate in the war between Russia and Ukraine. It puts forward that peace must be based on respecting the sovereignty of states and must include agreements on humanitarian aid, prisoner exchanges and grain exports. Cyril Ramaphosa describing the talks as impactful. And while it's clear brokering any deal between the two countries will be difficult, it's not clear if a step in the right direction was actually taken this past weekend. Well, let's get the Ukrainian perspective. I'm joined by Ukraine's ambassador to South Africa, Liubov Abravitova. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us in studio. You've obviously been in contact with your government, but also watching from South Africa as this developed over the weekend. Is there a sense from your government that perhaps a little bit of progress was made by this visit this weekend?
Good evening, and thank you for having me again in the studio. It was a very important initiative from our point of view because it allowed us to show African leaders what is happening on the ground, what are the consequences of Russian aggression, and to realize that those consequences that Africa is having today are caused by Russia's aggressive actions and by the violation of international law. It also allowed us to show the consequences of Russian atrocities in Bucha. You know that the heads of delegations were able to see that on their own eyes. Of course, unprecedented message from Putin to African leaders was the missile attack on Kiev that was coinciding with their visit.
So what do you make of this? We heard that report that missiles were raining down on Kiev as the African leaders were arriving. But then Vincent Magwenya, who is our president's spokesperson, I think it was, said, we don't hear any missiles.
We all know, and the president of South Africa approved it during the press conference, that they were aware and that they had to go to the shelter. So I hope that the delegation was that much safe deep in the shelter that they couldn't hear the explosions.
So perhaps that message, social media message, was fired off before he realized actually what was going on, do you think?
Maybe it just was taken out of context.
Yeah, could be.
Anyway, this is something that is not questioned. This is the reality that African leaders were facing, and this is the question that they should ask Putin, or at least themselves, before even decide to continue their trip to Russia. Because clearly this is when Russian side is showing either they are not controlling their army, and this is the question to Putin, if he is still in control of his army, or maybe they just showing that they don't want peace negotiations.
Does your president, Volodymyr Zelensky, see our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, as neutral, non-aligned in this?
The composition of delegation was very diverse in terms of the approach of representatives of these countries towards Russian aggression in Ukraine. And in this diversity, I think, was a lot of sense, because the president simultaneously could address all the positions during their engagements. We do believe that South Africa is an important player in African continent, and the presence of His Excellency Ramaphosa in Ukraine was meaningful for us.
Does your president trust that he will be a good broker for peace?
Well, the delegation as itself, being the delegation of equals coming to speak on their own behalf, was perceived as the chance to discuss certain points of the peace formula introduced by President Zelensky. And that's something that very clearly was told to the advanced groups, to all the delegations with whom we were engaging before this visit was happening. We already had quite a number of different peace initiatives that I'm sure you are aware about. And the first message that we are sending is that we are really ready to speak to everyone, because no one more than Ukrainians need and want peace, according to all the norms of the UN Charter, as was confirmed by all the members of delegations. But on the
you're talking, of course, about the issue of sovereignty.
Of course.
You know, UN-recognized countries, and therein lies probably the biggest problem. The indications are that the Russian president is not going to make a deal without some Ukrainian land, or perhaps that's changing. Do you think there is a possibility of a deal without Ukraine ceding some land to Russia?
There is no such a possibility, and it's very clearly pronounced by my president. There cannot be any compromise by Ukrainian territory or by Ukrainian desire to receive its security guarantees, and I'm clearly speaking about NATO, about its right to have a choice that the people want to make. And during the conference of Putin with presidents and heads of delegations, he also was giving them a lesson of his propaganda, where clearly he was showing them that he lives in parallel reality when he speaks about UN Charter to African leaders, them who yesterday were under the missile attack. Isn't that not ridiculous?
It does seem not very peaceful, let's put it that way, to have missiles raining down on Kyiv as your African peace delegation arrives. So how hopeful are you that this peace mission might make more progress than others that have failed before it?
Let's now focus on what are the further steps of this mission. We very much hope that this is not a single act movie, that we have an option to see the continued engagement of these leaders amongst themselves, but also maybe the broader representation of African countries. All of them were referring to the food security and complications for Africa because of this war, but this is not only the reasons that why they should be interested in bringing Putin to accountability, to make him respect international law and UN Charter, because we discussed with you many times, if this is allowed today to violate these norms, then the world will definitely not become a safer place.
Those people who support the Russian president often say that he was provoked, that NATO was getting too cozy with Ukraine, that he feared Ukraine would allow NATO to bring its troops far too close to his territory. What is your response to people who say actually Putin was provoked?
What he achieved is even bigger. Today, the bigger countries, bigger than Ukraine, are getting closer through NATO. And we're talking about 2 extra countries that are going to become members of NATO. So he is the best salesperson of NATO last year.
So you're saying it's a bit of an own goal, because in a way it made countries who were not part of NATO now join. Your country is not yet part of NATO. What is the position regarding NATO?
We are coming closer now to the summit of NATO in Lithuania, and we are very much hoping that certain roadmap will be offered to Ukraine regarding the guarantees of security, but also regarding the further assistance to Ukraine by separate NATO members, because as you know, we are not receiving any military assistance from the NATO as an organization, because it doesn't have the proactive or aggressive character. This is the protective alliance, and that's something that we don't take into account when we are even allowing Russian side to speculate on the NATO issue. No one was ever threatening to Russia and could not because of the nature of this organization. So we very much hope for the continued assistance from the partner countries, but also that they would provide us with kind of road map for our future membership in this alliance.
While the latest peace efforts hopefully continue, what is life like for ordinary Ukrainians? When this war broke out in February last year, I think it was something like 3 million Ukrainians fled the country. Since then, a number of them have come back, and we have seen cities bombarded. But it seems life goes on as well in a way. Just give us an idea of how difficult life is for ordinary Ukrainians at the moment.
It is very strange, probably for the visitors coming in Ukraine, to see Ukrainians being so resistant and strong. And I experienced it with my own eyes when I was in Ukraine in December. When you are living between missile attacks, you have to protect your children and your family. You have to be able to hide in the shelter, but as soon as missile attack goes off, you are operating as usual. You are working, you are providing education to your children, because this is our future. We have already to think how we are going to rebuild our economy and country. Moreover, you never know whether you will wake up. We only pray that our anti-missile forces will be able again to hit most of the missiles and rockets that are sent into us. But you recently have seen that the scope of Russian terror goes far beyond just military. It's also the Kakhovka Dam that was exploded by Russians, and that left a lot of people without homes, without drinking water. Many were died. We're still going to see more victims because the water is going down, and unfortunately not all the people were able to rescue.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming into studio and speaking to us about what life is like in Ukraine, and also your government's response to those peace efforts. Much appreciated. Ukraine's ambassador to South Africa, Liubov Abravitova.